Hi, I'm Dr. Shiloh.
And I'm Dr. Scott.
And this is LA Not So Confidential, the forensic psychology and true crime podcast.
In each episode, we explore the intersection of psychology, the criminal justice system, and entertainment.
Today, our episode is on the forensic psych topics of conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and psychopathy.
Welcome back, everybody. We're so glad you're back for this episode that Dr. Shiloh and I have been wanting to do for a very long time. We're circling back around to an element of mental health disorders that we've talked about in the past that are integrally intertwined with criminal behavior. So sit back. It's going to be a lot of information coming at you, and please be patient with my stronger Southern accent than usual. I have relatives visiting this week.
That's
and it's
so
contagious.
funny.
It is contagious. We were shopping last night out at the farmer's market and eating at one of the restaurants. And this woman at the table turned to me and said, "Where are you from? You're not from here." And it's like, nobody has commented on my accent in a long time. So
You're like, I live
funny.
down the street, lady.
I'm literally 2 blocks from here. Okay.
She's like, oh, okay, you're good. No,
Yeah.
You're talking like that.
But everyone, for the locals, for the travelers, we have a Los Angeles Not So Confidential live event on Friday, April 11th, 2025. So if you're listening to this in the far-flung future, know that it's 2025 that we're really looking forward to. So there'll be more information on the website, on our social media. Please put that in your calendars if you'd like to join us. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then we've also started the process of planning a summer tour with our favorite tour guide, Chris, who is off the hook fantastic. And this time, instead of being in downtown Los Angeles, we're going to be on the famous, the fabulous, and quite formidable Sunset Strip. There's a lot of stuff to talk about on the Sunset Strip.
There's a lot of stuff. And I was also thinking there's so many cool places to like go and eat or grab a drink before and after.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We just got to pick a date for that, but we'll want to do that during the summertime in the evening. So it's great weather and all the craziness of Hollywood is at your fingertips.
Exactly. Maybe we can get the West Hollywood Sheriff's Department to sit in with us and tell us about some of the stories of what they had to deal with. Or I can tell some stories of the ride-alongs I went on when I was with Sheriff's Department. All right. Just Dr. Shiloh, please catch us up on the last episode.
Okay, everyone. So in our last episode, we had a really interesting live conversation with Justin Evans of Generation Y and, of course, his solo podcast, The Peripheral. We always have great discussions with Justin in person. And the last time that we were all together, we decided it's worth taking a look back at Matthew Perry's death and really drilling down and looking at the cause of death, along with the stigma that comes from deaths where substances are involved. And then even peeling back another layer of looking at the ways in which we as consumers and the media try to understand these deaths when a celebrity is involved versus a non-celebrity, which we really just don't ever hear about. It touched on so many poignant topics. I think it's really becoming one of my favorite behind the couch conversations we've ever had. And we've had some really great responses.
We've had a lot of great behind the couches. We've had a lot of great responses on this particular episode. And I would agree with you. And I would even add on that those conversations we were having were not only about we as consumers versus the media, but all three of us as content creators are involved in this conversation, and it's complex. And, you know, it gets people riled up. People want to get very concrete about this very, very complex issue, you know, and it requires critical thinking in the same way that really being an informed consumer of true crime content really should require us to be critical thinkers about where did this person come from? Again, as I always say, because I always go back to Wicked, was she born this way, or did the world kind of do this to her? Or what's the lens that we're looking through from week to week, from year to year, or decade to decade as we look back on some of these things? So yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to it, folks, please go back and give it a listen or give it a watch on YouTube.
I love that you've been quoting Wicked since the beginning of our podcast, and then now it's like back in a huge thing.
I know, and in a way that I enjoy, because I was really like kind of holding like, I don't know if it's going to be that good. And then I enjoyed it so much because there was so much that was drawn from the book, which is very, very dark. And even my husband, Dan, who is like, he's a big Broadway person, but this was not one of his favorite shows. but he turned after the movie. He goes, well, now everything makes sense. Like I understand
Mm,
the backstory and blah, blah, blah. But I digress. We're not talking about Wicked. We are talking about dun, 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 dun,
yeah.
attachment disorders and the intersection of personality disorders. So, folks, over the past 7.5 years, we've spoken pretty expansively about this intersection between personality disorders and crime and whether or not those personality disorders are full blown or just certain flavors.
Yeah, or like an ish of
An
one of those.
ish of like, kind of like a LaCroix fizzy water, right? Like,
Yeah,
so it's, you're drinking a lemon fizzy water and it's like you're drinking bubbles and somebody is whispering lemon from 2 blocks away, right?
exactly.
But those flavors can actually have a huge impact on the way that we as individuals interact with the world around us. And of course, we always want to refer to the most recent and validated research on our particular areas of work and interest and discussion here on the show. So we're following up on our previous episode about attachment disorders and how they're entangled with so many of the behaviors and the presentations of personality disorders. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that 2-part episode, because of course, we over researched and we just
Yep.
did so much we couldn't burden people with a 3-hour episode. Please go back and get that under your belt before diving into this week's.
Yes. And just as a trigger warning for this week, this episode includes discussions of sexual assault, murder, and self mutilation.
Any aficionado of the true crime genre is well acquainted with some of the high profile criminals that clearly have strong diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. We all know Ted Bundy, notorious serial killer who displayed many ASPD traits, including manipulation, deceit, and a clear lack of remorse. And there's the fascinating case of Richard Kuklinski, also known as the Iceman, and he was a contract killer with documented ASPD traits, including aggression and emotional detachment. But many wouldn't necessarily immediately assume that a wealthy financial advisor would fit the bill as well. But Bernie Madoff was a white-collar criminal who ran the largest Ponzi scheme in known history, exhibiting traits like deception and exploitation. So, back to Wicked. Is it nature or nurture? Did they emerge from the womb with full-on ASPD wiring? Well, the good
Mm.
thing is that we have clinical research on the relationship between attachment styles and personality disorders, and it has been extensively studied, particularly in the last 2 decades. What has emerged from this research is significant correlations that expand and deepen our understanding of psychopathology, the overwhelming drive for criminal activity. There's a direct relationship between the role of early attachment experiences and the development of these conditions. And if you listen to the last episode, you know that disorganized attachment patterns can significantly impair affect or emotional regulation, as well as contribute to the development of personality disorders like ASPD, although borderline personality disorder has also shown to be quite prominent as well.
Yes, but we are not going to follow down that yellow brick road today. We're
Right.
going to stick with really a bit of a journey here down a very dark path for sure. But when we ponder back on all of the disrupted attachments that we discovered in those episodes, episode 198 and 199, I know we keep referencing them, and also think about personality disorders, it seems obvious that there's a trajectory there and that we need to touch on some other crossovers in diagnoses and phenomenon in forensic psychology, and frankly, things that we've been covering since episode 2 of this podcast, when we go all the way back and look at our first episodes on psychopathy. So let's stick with childhood behavior and parse out conduct disorder first before tying this into an adult personality disorder and beyond. Conduct disorder is a mental health condition that affects children and teens that's characterized by a consistent pattern of aggressive behaviors and actions that harm the well-being of others. Children with conduct disorder also often violate rules and societal norms, and conduct disorder lies on a spectrum of disruptive behavioral disorders, which also includes oppositional defiant disorder, which is something different, but we're going to stay on track here. So again, conduct disorder only affects children and adolescents. It can have early onset before the age of 10, but commonly develops in adolescence, which is up to 19 years old in this case. The condition is more common in male children than female children, and the average age of presentation is 10 to 12 years in males, and then a little bit later, 14 to 16 years in females. So, conduct disorder affects anywhere between 2 and 10% of children and adolescents in the United States. I think it's important to ask here, what is the difference between conduct disorder and personality disorders, just to make sure we're all on the same page? So, a personality disorder is a mental health condition that involves long lasting, disruptive patterns of thinking, as well as behavior, as well as mood, and then how that all relates to others. Like, how is that negatively impacting the people around them? Most personality disorders begin in the teen years when obviously personality is further developing and maturing. And as a result, almost all people diagnosed with personality disorders are above the age of 18. Traditionally, we don't want to label them prior to that. One exception to this is antisocial personality disorder, in that approximately 80% of people with this disorder started to show symptoms by the age of 11. So let's put a pin in that. We will come back to antisocial personality disorder, but that's the one that we start to see very, very early, hence conduct disorder.
So, what are the signs and the symptoms of conduct disorder? So, characteristic behaviors of conduct disorder develop gradually over the time. It's not just like a kid wakes up and has this radical change in behavior. If that happens, you get your kid to a doctor immediately, right? Because a radical change of behavior is usually having to do something neurological, trauma, or medical. So, definitely not that in this situation. Children with conduct disorder tend to be impulsive and difficult to manage, and research has shown that individuals with these traits have abnormalities in the way their brain processes moral decision making, even at the pre high school level, right? So they're already seeing a very different way of how this child is walking through the world. From an early age, they don't seem to be concerned about the feelings of other people. And many times, in retrospect, when parents are being interviewed, they will say, I knew something was different about my
Yeah.
child. I knew
Yeah.
something was off. So, the four core behaviors of conduct disorder include aggression towards people and animals, or like the way we use the typical term in diagnostic criteria is violating others' basic rights. So, violating their bodily autonomy, violating their property, their personal space, that kind of thing. Point two is destruction of property. Point three is deceiving, lying, and or stealing. And point four is serious violation of rules. So signs of aggressive behavior towards other include bullying, physical violence, potentially even with a weapon as a child, verbal fights, threatening, forcing sexual activity, and blaming others for their own behavior as well as hurting animals. Going on to that second point we discussed just now was signs of the destruction of property will include intentionally setting fires and vandalizing or purposely destroying other people's property. Point three, signs of deceiving and lying and stealing would include lying to get a favor or to avoid responsibilities, stealing from individuals or from retail establishments, or going so far as to break into houses or businesses. And then the signs of the violation of rules would include breaking rules without a clear reason. So part of the development through the teen years is breaking rules. You're learning to be your own individual, but there's usually a reason for it. Well, I wanted to go out, so that's why I snuck out my window.
Right.
But breaking rules without a clear reason is just, it's almost like they're seeking a form of stimulation for an
Hmm.
area of feeling that is just not working like other kids. Also can be exhibited by not going to school, which we call truancy here in the US, running away from home, or frequently breaking any rules set by their parents.
So there's other common signs of conduct disorder that don't necessarily fit neatly into those other categories, but you can see heavy alcohol use, substance use, engaging in frequent or risky types of sexual behavior, becoming easily frustrated, or making no effort at all to hide their aggressive behaviors is what we see as well. And then comes the not showing remorse for those things. So you have
Right.
the behaviors, but then we're starting to see the personality, the affect piece of it. And another key component, we always look holistically when we're doing an assessment, is looking at those social relationships. And these individuals tend to have a difficulty making and maintaining friendships. It is important to note that, like you touched on, occasional rebellious behavior is very common during childhood and
Yeah.
adolescence, with studies showing that like 50 to 80% of youth engage in some form of something we could label as antisocial behavior during their development, but only a small percentage ever meet the criteria for disorders like conduct disorder. We're talking like some studies on the low end, 1.8%, and then some studies going up to the high end of like 16%. So the signs and symptoms that lead to the diagnosis of conduct disorder demonstrate a disruptive and repetitive pattern, and the previously described types of actions violate, again, those rights of others and fall under that category of quote unquote antisocial behavior.
So all of this research doesn't exactly point to one specific exact cause of the disorder, but as you have probably guessed, it seems to be a complex combination of genetic, biological, and environmental factors. And we're going to emphasize here complex combination. So, genetic or biological factors, various studies have shown that certain characteristics of conduct disorder can be inherited. And that would include some of the antisocial behaviors, the impulsivity, the temperament changes, aggression, and the insensitivity to punishment. That's a really big one. Insensitivity to punishment, as well as high testosterone levels that are associated with aggression, traumatic brain injury, seizures, and neurological damage, of course, can all contribute to aggression as well.
And then when it comes to the parental, familial, and environmental factors, we're talking some really interesting statistics where the research shows that parents of adolescents with conduct disorder have often engaged in substance use and antisocial behaviors themselves. They're also frequently diagnosed with ADHD, mood disorders, schizophrenia, or antisocial personality disorder. We also sometimes see a home environment that lacks structure and adequate supervision, with frequent conflicts between the parents. And then that can lead to maladaptive behavior in the children, which can then go on to be associated with conduct disorder. We also see that in children that are exposed to frequent domestic violence are more likely to develop conduct disorder. And then living in low social and economic environments with overcrowding and unemployment leads to economic and social stress. With that, I would say that, and then coupled with the lack of adequate parenting, can be breeding ground as well for conduct disorder. So we just know that conduct disorder ends up impacting more children living in low economic environments than not. We also see the availability of drugs and increased crime in a child's neighborhood then can increase their risk of developing conduct disorder. So, having said all that, again, it's really important to note that conduct disorder can occur in children from very high functioning, quote unquote, healthy families that maybe aren't experiencing some of these things as well.
Yeah, you're bringing up some really interesting stuff. I want to clarify something that in households with high ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, which may or may not be the result of intended abuse on the physical, sexual, or emotional level, some households just have problems because
Yeah.
life throws problems at us, right? But what you will see is that you can see some kids acting out in anger because of the situation they're in that have nothing to do with conduct disorder or have nothing to
Mhm.
do with oppositional defiant disorder. You can also see children come from really, really adverse situations who go on to be highly, highly, highly successful people and hyper independent from a very young age, which is not always a good thing. Success is good. I mean, certainly not going to downplay how good it is to be successful and be able to support your family and maybe increase your quality of lifestyle. But sometimes we have to take into account that kids that are placed with way too much responsibility and way too many adult activities of daily living before they are developmentally ready for it, they're going to be cashing that check that their parents wrote for them many years later. And that's why a lot of people end up in therapy, actually, is trying to disentangle that stuff. So that was just like a little side note I wanted to put in there so that we make sure that we're not shaming families that have situations out of their control. There's the panoply or the spectrum of human behavior and development is very, very wide and very, very complex. The prognosis or the long-term outlook for conduct disorder really, really depends on how early the condition developed and if it was treated. So usually the disruptive behaviors of conduct stop during early adulthood. But in about one third of the cases, they will continue. And many of these cases will meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, or certainly, like we were saying, an ish, a flavor, a shadow. Early onset of the condition before 10 years of age is associated with a much poorer long term prognosis and is strongly associated with a significant decline in school performance. So, again, really important stuff for people out there that are fascinated by true crime and the history of the people who commit these crimes. Looking at that factor, these types of behaviors before the age of 10 decline in school performance. Those are things to watch out for. It just means that, like, in that moment, the chemicals in their head are creating a storm that's going to have long-term impact on that child's life. Depression and bipolar disorder may also develop in the teen years and early adulthood, and suicidal ideation can be a complication because of these conditions. It's important to get your child immediate medical care if they're talking about or threatening suicide. Don't shut down the conversation, continue the conversation. Let your child know that they are being heard, but also seek outside help.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's look at a case study here just to round out conduct disorder to highlight what this looks like in real life. Michael Perry was diagnosed with conduct disorder in the eighth grade. His early life was marked by behavioral issues, including truancy and theft. And despite interventions, his antisocial behavior escalated, leading to his involvement in serious crimes, eventually including murder. So, raised in Texas, Perry's childhood had significant instability, as well as financial struggles and some family dysfunction. Background research and police reports suggest that his parents had a strained relationship and his upbringing lacked structure and discipline. Perry exhibited behavioral issues from an early age, engaging in petty crimes and showing some early signs of conduct disorder.
According to Perry's confession in 2001, he and his friend Jason Aaron Burkett conspired to steal two vehicles from the parents of Adam Stotler, a 17-year-old acquaintance. The very poorly planned crime went south when Burkett approached the Stotler residence, knocked on the front door, and asked to use the phone. Meanwhile, Perry, armed with a shotgun, entered through the back door via the garage and concealed himself in the laundry room. Sandra Stotler, Adam's mother, opened the back door. Perry emerged from his hiding place and shot her in the side. As she fell and attempted to rise, Perry then shot her again, fatally wounding her. Perry and Burkett then loaded her body into the back of the truck and dumped the body in a nearby lake, attempting to hide their crime. The two immediately left to pick up Kristen Willis, another friend, from work, and then returned to the Stotler home. Later, Adam Stotler and his friend Jeremy Richardson arrived. Unaware of what had transpired, Burkett and Perry lured them into a wooded area under the false pretense that a friend had been shot and needed help. Once they were deep in the woods, Burkett shot and killed both Adam and Jeremy. The group then returned to the Stotler home before heading to a bar to continue their night.
So, 2 days later, law enforcement attempted to stop Perry for a traffic violation, and he sped off from the stop, leading to a dangerous high speed police chase. When he was finally apprehended, he attempted to conceal his identity by providing authorities with Adam Stotler's identity, as he had just happened to have Stotler's wallet on him after these crimes. Perry was taken into custody but released on bail a few days later. He and Burkett soon found themselves in trouble again. While driving a stolen car, he again attempted to evade law enforcement, but ended up crashing into a deputy sheriff's vehicle. Their final escape attempt ended with both men being arrested while hiding in a nearby apartment complex. The shotgun used in Sandra Stotler's murder was discovered at the scene, along with forensic evidence linking Perry to the crime.
Perry was charged with Sandra Stotler's murder, and the forensic evidence from Crater Lake, the wooded crime scene, and the Stotler residence aligned with his confession. During the trial, Perry completely asserted an about face and recanted his confession statement, claiming that he was coerced by law enforcement. The jury found this defense unconvincing, and he was convicted. He was then executed by lethal injection in Texas on July 1st, 2010. His accomplice, Jason Burkett, was tried separately, convicted of capital murder, and sentenced to life in prison. So this particular example really does highlight that not following rules, impulsivity, lack of judgment, lack of insight into what's going to happen. As we've talked about on this show before, when people engage in high speed chases, there's one of maybe a few things. One is drugs may be involved, like they may
Sure.
be so impaired by the use of drugs that they're really not thinking it through, or they know they're at the end of their rope and that there's
Mhm.
no choice left. So why not turn it into like sort of a shot for glory?
Yep.
Or they actually think that they may be able to get away. So that lack of sort of intellectual functioning in that moment, they're actually getting high. It takes so much to get a person with the wiring for ASPD to get them stimulated in the way that you or I might be able to get stimulated from something that we find enjoyable. They will go to these extreme ends without insight or judgment into what the consequences are going to be.
Yeah, definitely. And that was a very heavy case study, but, one where we were able to find where the perpetrator did have this conduct disorder diagnosis. And I think, with that extreme example, many of you are probably thinking, well, maybe conduct disorder is sounding a lot like antisocial personality disorder or even psychopathy, especially after that example. And yes, ASPD is the adult version of conduct disorder, if we want to frame it that way. There's not that much difference between conduct disorder and ASPD. And in fact, conduct disorder is essentially a point criteria for ASPD. There needs to be evidence of conduct disorder before the age of 15 for somebody to meet full criteria for antisocial personality disorder, along, of course, with the pervasive pattern of deviating from social norms on their own, and then the functional impairment that that disorder causes to the adult's life. But it's estimated to affect between 0.6% and 3.6% of adults. And it's 3 times more common among men than women. And individuals with antisocial personality disorder often also have co occurring mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and/or substance use disorders.
Right. We've talked a lot about ASPD on this show in various forms. So we thought it's maybe time to give a little historical perspective as to how this diagnosis has been shaped over the years. In the 19th century, British physician William Pritchard used the term moral insanity to describe individuals who engaged in antisocial behaviors. Now, we're starting in the 19th century, although you can go back as far as like a great example is a book, The Killer of Little Shepherds, is a great example of something that was happening in the 16th century, which is frightening. But the research and the naming and the nomenclature really started around this time. So Pritchard believed that these individuals lacked a moral compass, and that in itself has continued to be a key characteristic of what we now find and call antisocial personality disorder. So it's a complex disorder that's been difficult for psychiatrists and psychologists to really fully understand. However, Dr. Daniel Goodwin and Dr. Samuel Hughes provided a clear definition in their book, Psychiatric Diagnosis. They described ASPD as a persistent pattern of socially irresponsible, exploitative, and guiltless behavior that affects many areas of life, including family, school, work, and relationships. But that description is just an illustration of symptoms, which may actually arise from a number of complex and interwoven factors. The symptoms of ASPD exist on a spectrum, ranging from relatively mild behaviors like lying and cheating to much more severe actions like violent crimes, including rape and murder.
The work of Dr. Lee Robbins in the 1950s and 60s was instrumental in shaping the diagnostic criteria for ASPD, which were included in the DSM 3 in 1980 and refined, of course, in later editions. According to the DSM 5, a person must meet the following conditions to be diagnosed with ASPD. We have the point of a minimum of 3 out of 7 pathological traits, such as deceitfulness, impulsivity, aggression, recklessness, and irresponsibility. Another point, as we mentioned just a little bit ago, is they have to be 18 years or older and showed signs of conduct disorder before the age of 15. We also know that one of the criteria, which is pretty common, is that these symptoms must not be caused by basically some other diagnosis, and specifically here, schizophrenia or mania. So again, ASPD is the only personality disorder in the DSM-5 that has that age requirement, which really reflects its chronic nature and the early developmental roots.
Yeah, it reminds me in my position last year, I had a particularly challenging call to make. I've been working with a parent about a child referral. This child had engaged in self-harm behaviors, was having troubles at school, but there was nothing acting out against other students. There was no
Mhm.
threats of violence, but there was really some significant affect issues and just quality of life issues. And because of the insurance this family had, the child was sent to a company here in California that is across the state, and they do nothing but psychiatric care, no therapy, just
Okay.
psychiatric care, and it's all telehealth.
Oh, geez.
So already you can see some problems. And the mom, by the time I was talking to mom was just in tears. Like, we were talking to this clinician, and I'm not going to say what discipline they are, but they were a medical clinician doing these diagnoses. And within 10 minutes of the call talking to the child who was under the age of 12, the clinician closed his DSM and said, "Well, I don't have an adolescent DSM. I don't have that version. I just have the adult, but clearly you have borderline personality disorder."
What?
Yeah. So
You're like, that version doesn't exist because we don't diagnose adolescents.
exactly, right. So as Dr. Shiloh will be the first to attest, Dr. Scott can get his Southern up.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm usually quite professional, but I tracked down this clinician through the office manager and demanded a call back and had to actually kind of threaten that I was going to report them to the board. And I
Mhm.
got on the phone. I just let that clinician have it. I was like, "What are you doing? Like, how these are the basic rules. You're a psychiatric practitioner of this, or you're supposed to know this. And what harm did you do?" And that, I mean, the person was very surprised because apparently nobody had ever called them on their bullshit. But
Wow. Yeah.
again, this is an illustration of how careful we have to be with diagnostic labels, right? And that's why they really have significant and substantial research that has made conduct disorder clearly to be a factor that has to be present for a real diagnosis of ASPD.
Right.
And none of the other personality disorders have it.
Yep. Yep.
So,
Wow.
as forensic psychologists, Dr. Shiloh and I have worked with a number of people with an ASPD diagnosis. And it is really interesting to note some of the challenges in diagnosis and treatment of the disorder. So, psychiatrist Dr. David Black states that many of the mental health professionals feel unprepared to treat individuals with ASPD and may then avoid working with them altogether. So, outside of forensic psychology in the prison system or jail system, ASPD is often overlooked by clinicians, which is really concerning. A clinician's discomfort with particular traits or behaviors may make that clinician less likely to notice them occurring in non obvious ways. And that's a problem. We can't avoid these things as clinicians and be thoroughly ready to give the public treatment. And despite being a relatively small percentage of the population, individuals with ASPD have a high significant societal impact, right? So here's this sliver of the population that really can impact the community at large.
Yeah.
And we've got a bunch of clinicians that are like, "Oh no, I don't work with that. I don't deal with that." And studies show that 30.6% to 84% of prison populations meet the criteria for ASPD, with US estimates averaging around 50% within the prison system. But wait, there's more. As we've said many times on multiple episodes over the years, the most important research regarding personality disorders has emerged over the past 1 to 2 decades. And this is where our understanding of the disorder extended beyond the pretty rigid framework of nurture into a very complex nexus of both environment and genetics.
Yes. The biological basis of antisocial behavior is, again, complex. We're using that word a lot today. And it involves a combination of many genetic factors, brain structure abnormalities, particularly in that prefrontal cortex, as well as imbalances in neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, and the dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, which often manifests as low arousal levels, which can contribute to a predisposition towards antisocial actions and risky behavior. So, as far as the genetics go, just super interesting to look at some of these studies. And always fascinating. Studies on twins and families indicate a significant genetic component to antisocial behavior, suggesting certain genes may predispose individuals to this aggressive or impulsive tendencies and actions. And then when it comes to the prefrontal cortex, research often points to reduced activity or some structural abnormalities in the prefrontal cortex. That region is really crucial for your decision making, impulsivity, moral reasoning. So we're either finding that some things just don't light up or the structure is actually different. And then we have the amygdala, deep in the middle of your brain. And this area is associated with processing emotions, and dysfunction can lead to difficulty in recognizing or responding to others' distress, again, potentially contributing to antisocial behavior. And then we have the interior cingulate cortex, and this plays a role in conflict monitoring and decision making. And so when you have abnormalities in this region, we find that there's more impulsive behavior related to that.
So again, just kind of looking at a big perspective, let's back away and look at all four of those areas that you just mentioned. Although the amygdala is very, very deep inside the brain, it's part
Mhm.
of really one of the most primitive parts of our brain. It's not later in the evolutionary
No,
process.
no.
But this is a great sort of primer for understanding how impactful traumatic brain injury can be. So you can take someone who doesn't have any of the structural issues or any of the wiring, but you conk them on the head in these particular areas a number of times, lesions can form and then cause a personality change later in life. So there is the structure issue, but let's look at also on top of it this layer of chemical dysfunction. So when we look in sort of the category of neurotransmitters, serotonin, low serotonin levels have been linked to aggression and impulsivity, potentially contributing to antisocial behavior. Then dopamine. So dopamine dysregulation and is involved in the reward processing centers of our brain, and it can lead to increased sensation seeking and potential engagement in risky antisocial acts. And then there's the ANS, which is the autonomic nervous system. And there's this theory, which is fascinating, called low arousal theory. And some research is now suggesting that individuals with antisocial tendencies exhibit a lower resting heart rate and reduced ANS activity, leading to a decreased sensitivity to potential negative consequences of their actions. One of the really amazing and frightening sets of studies that this research emerged from was focusing on intimate partner violence and male abusers of their partners. And what they noted was that these guys would get so violent against their partners, and yet their heart rates would barely go up.
Yep. Yep.
And there's also the cinematic version of this would be in Silence in the Lambs, when you see Dr. Hannibal Lecter, he's, sequestered, I think, a piece of a pen, a writing pen, and he's been able to get out of his cuffs and get out of his restraints. And when his meal is delivered, he takes down two security guards, but what they do is they do it in slow motion to classical music. And I thought that was like really a great artistic expression because it's actually showing, as far as Hannibal Lecter's concerned, he's going in slow motion. His system is just down regulating, down regulating, down regulating. So fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. So just, important consideration here. Also, we have all of the other environmental factors that we've talked about, the childhood trauma, the abuse, the social influences. This could also impact antisocial behavior, the development of it, but that it is that complex interplay between all of those things. Antisocial behavior is not solely caused by just those biological factors. Those are important. Those are things that we're learning more and more about every single day. But as as we'll reference again towards the end, remember there's a multi-legged stool here. So we need to keep that in mind always.
So our next case study begins on April 28th, 1996, when 28-year-old Martin Bryant carried out one of the deadliest mass shootings in modern history, killing 35 people and injuring 37 others in the historic tourist site of Port Arthur, Tasmania. He provided conflicting and confusing accounts of his motivations, with several reports suggesting that he craved attention and harbored a deep resentment towards those that he felt wronged him. Martin John Bryant was born on May 7th, 1967 in Tasmania, Australia, to Maurice and Carlene Bryant. He was the eldest of two children, and later review and interviews with family, friends, and neighbors indicated that he displayed odd and troubling behaviors, including violence, from an early age. He was also noted to engage in animal cruelty and bullying of his peers. His family life was characterized by emotional detachment and social difficulties. His father, Maurice, was known as a hardworking and quiet man, while his mother, Carlene, was often described in news of the day as strict and emotionally distant. So let's be careful. We're not going to go in the direction of schizophrenic mom shaming. That's not a
Right.
thing. Again, even if it's been since 1996, beginning in 1967 with his birth, the passage of time and the perspective of what we do to women, I feel like we have to just look through this through a very careful lens.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to share with you so people didn't think that we were leaving things out intentionally. Bryant's mother stated in a 2011 interview that when he was very young, she described him as annoying and a different child, and often surrounded by toys that he had intentionally broken.
Mm.
This is interesting to me because, on one hand, the media is saying that she was cold and distant. And then this can also feel like we need to talk about Kevin,
Yeah,
which
for
is
sure.
Tilda Swinton in that wonderful role in the movie, which I know the book portrays the mother's character as having some of her own antisocial tendencies as
Oh,
well.
okay. Got it.
But in the movie, it's portrayed as she just keeps trying to get the doctors to talk to her about her son, trying to get her husband to acknowledge that these behaviors are there. And it's all falling on deaf ears.
So, as a child, Brian struggled academically and socially. At an early age, he was diagnosed with an IQ of 66, which is considered in the range of intellectual disability. He was placed in special education classes where he continued to have mental health and behavioral challenges. Teachers that were later interviewed offered that Bryant often displayed inappropriate emotional responses, sometimes laughing at situations that were serious or even distressing, while also exhibiting sudden outbursts that included violence. And that then made him an outcast among his peers. He was reported to have pulled a snorkel from another child's face while they were diving and cutting down trees on a neighbor's property. So we're already seeing a couple of those prongs that we looked at with conduct disorder and then antisocial personality disorder. Brian's behavior became increasingly problematic as he grew older, with multiple referrals to professionals for psychiatric treatment. And at age 17, a psychologist described him as, quote, mentally retarded with signs of a severe personality disorder, end quote.
So, despite his low intellectual capacity, his poor social skills, and ongoing emotional instability, he was able to financially sustain himself coming from disability pension provided by the Australian government. And then, in this very, very strange turn of events, Bryant became friends with an eccentric, wealthy heiress named Helen Harvey. And after becoming her gardener, the local authorities discovered that both Harvey and her elderly mother were actually in need of medical care. So Bryant and his father cleaned up the dilapidated mansion for the patron to return from the hospital. And in 1987, Bryant was invited, allegedly, to move into her lavish home, where she gave him a very extravagant lifestyle, purchasing him expensive clothing and cars and all sorts of things, and also allowing him to live without any responsibilities. And his father later noted to authorities that he was always worried about Bryant's emotional and physical rages. So the avoidance of which required his family basically just to walk around on eggshells. They all avoided confrontation with him from an early age because he would go into these rages. And his father went on to say that on numerous occasions throughout his childhood, Bryant would threaten to go out and shoot people up.
Mm.
So in 1992, Harvey, his benefactor, died in a car accident, leaving Bryant as the sole beneficiary of her will, providing him a mansion and assets worth over $1 million. However, Bryant's mother, concerned about his inability to manage finances, was successful in petitioning the courts to place his assets under a guardianship, giving legal trustees controls over his finances.
Bryant began to travel extensively, both within Australia and internationally, with his newfound wealth, but continued to struggle with social interactions due to his odd behavior. His instability to form meaningful relationships or integrate into society led to growing frustrations and to his deepening resentment and anger. On April 28th, 1996, Bryant armed himself and went on a shooting spree. His victims included a couple who purchased a property he had wanted. He then made his way to a Port Arthur historic site and opened fire indiscriminately on tourists and staff. The attack continued as he fled the scene, continuing to shoot people along the way before finally barricading himself at Seascape Guest House, the scene of his initial murder. He then held police at bay for 18 hours with a hostage that he later killed. He was sentenced to 35 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and the horrific crime ended up being a turning point in Australian gun laws. In response to the tragedy, the Howard government swiftly implemented sweeping gun control measures, including a ban on semi-automatic rifles and high-capacity shotguns, as well as a mandatory gun buyback program that led to the destruction of over 640,000 firearms and stricter firearm licensing and registration laws. These changes remain some of the strictest gun laws in the world, with, of course, ongoing debates about their effectiveness. However, Australia has not experienced another mass shooting on the scale of Port Arthur since these laws were enacted. So, if one keeps chugging down this track that we're on from conduct disorder to antisocial personality disorder, we eventually get to psychopathy. And not literally, I don't mean that one always leads to the other or to the worst disorder. But if it does, this is sort of the end of the road. This is the last stop. So, as we've said before, this is conduct disorder or ASPD on steroids.
So, just doing a quick recap, since we literally have been talking about this topic since episode 2, psychopathy is, again, not a personality disorder per se, and it's not listed in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But psychopathy is related to antisocial behavior and the diagnosis of ASPD, but with additional traits like chronic manipulation, impulsivity, lack of empathy, and high risk-taking tendencies. So while psychopathy is relatively rare in the general population at less than 1%, studies suggest that up to 20% of prison populations meet the criteria, and they are responsible for around 50% of serious crimes. So again, adding into the science behind all this recent research, advances in brain imaging and genetics have resulted in studies that confirm that psychopathic traits can be inherited, appearing as early as childhood and persisting into adulthood with environmental factors such as abuse and, like I said earlier, high-level ACEs playing a part, ACEs being adverse childhood experiences.
So remember that three-legged stool of brain differences, genetic markers, and then severe childhood abuse being the formula for psychopathy as we know it today. Scientists have identified specific genes that may contribute to antisocial and psychopathic tendencies, especially those linked to dopamine, serotonin, and stress response systems. One of the most studied is MAOA, a gene involved in regulating neurotransmitters. So, individuals with a low activity version of this gene combined with the stressful or abusive upbringing have been found to be at a higher risk for aggression and criminal behavior. And then you throw some different brain structure on top of that, and you have a diagnosis. No. And then you have a recipe for psychopathy. So, although we cannot diagnose, there is a very well-established assessment tool, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, that can categorize an individual as psychopathic if they receive a score of 30 or above on the traits listed on that tool. Okay, so getting into a case study for psychopathy, this case is also from Australia. Gary David was diagnosed with a personality disorder and additionally labeled, quote, with psychopathic traits at age 13. David's childhood was filled with criminal activities and violent behaviors. His persistent antisocial conduct led to multiple incarcerations and highlighted the severe implications of untreated conduct disorder. Gary David was actually Gary Webb in 1954 and had an incredibly rough start to his life. His father, Rupert David, was a career criminal and known pedophile who spent much of his life in and out of prisons as well as psychiatric institutions. His mother, Betty David, struggled with alcoholism, leaving young Gary and his siblings to care for themselves, which resulted in Gary at the age of 4, along with his siblings, being removed from their home and placed into an orphanage, really marking the beginning of a childhood that was spent in the system. Key to this developmental period was instability and the abuse he experienced while being shuffled between orphanages, boys' homes, and detention centers. By age 11 years old, he was already committing minor crimes, including larceny and fraud. However, his behavior quickly escalated into more serious offenses, including making threats and acts of violence. At 13 years old, he was diagnosed with a personality disorder with psychopathic traits, a label that would follow him for the rest of his life.
As a young adult between 1976 and 1984, he was admitted to psychiatric facilities on 8 different occasions. Again, he was diagnosed with ASPD, but with a significant difference. They noted he exhibited extreme and frequent self-harm behaviors, including ingesting razor blades, various forms of self-mutilation, and swallowing corrosive liquids. The attending psychiatric staff saw these acts were a mix of self-destructive and manipulation due to their occurrences, often coinciding when he felt ignored or when he felt mistreated. In 1982, he attempted to rob a pizza restaurant in Rye, Victoria, but the attempt quickly escalated into a violent shootout with both the shop owner and a responding officer, both being severely wounded. David himself was shot in the legs while trying to escape. This robbery seemed less about money and more about creating chaos, as some believed that David's goal in this event was to orchestrate a police shootout. Following his arrest, he was sentenced to 14 years in prison for attempted murder, with the continuing of many of his previous expressions of self-harm or violent outburst orchestrated again in the prison system against both staff, peers, and himself. These behaviors made him a major security risk, and prison officials often struggled with how to manage him.
During his incarceration, David spent much of his time writing elaborate manifestos about massacres and violent revenge. His works contained scenarios that came off like horror movie cliches, while others were actually far more chilling in their reality based planning, including bombing public buildings, assassinating politicians, poisoning water supplies, and mass shootings in crowded areas. When questioned about these writings, David claimed they were part of a therapy exercise and not actual plans. By 1990, government health officials officially declared David mentally ill, which then led to a legal battle over his psychiatric status. Under the Mental Health Act of 1986, and again, this is in Australia, David had the right to appeal his diagnoses, which he did multiple times. And in May of 1990, a review board ruled that he was not mentally ill, arguing that, quote, a personality disorder was not classified as a mental illness under the law. So this decision, as you can imagine, sparked controversy, as many believe David was a clear danger to society.
This is a really great example of where law needs to integrate their understanding of mental health a lot better than they do. That is something that is ongoing to this day in the court systems across this country. You know, we're not trying to say that mental health diagnosis is a get out of jail free card at all, but it really does require sort of a more expansive and less narrow focus on how the judicial system approaches this. So on June 11th, 1993, at the age of 38, Gary David died by suicide in prison. He ingested razor blades, which caused severe internal injuries leading to peritonitis. By the time of his death, he had spent 33 years of his life in various institutions, prisons, and psychiatric facilities. David's case left a lasting impact on Australia's mental health and criminal justice systems. His life raised very difficult questions about how to handle individuals with extreme personality disorders who do not fit the traditional definitions of mental illness, but still pose a danger to society. His violent fantasies and erratic behavior sparked debates about risk management, involuntary hospitalization, and criminal responsibility.
So, I mean, I know that was a quick recap, but we've also talked about it a lot. And here we've kind of taken this journey again from, the previous two episodes of looking at attachment disorders and now how that crosses over into personality disorders. So, conduct disorder for people under the age of 18, then antisocial personality disorders for adults, and then the daddy of them all, psychopathy. But we want to also touch on a little branch off here. And back in episode 164, way back in 2023. I couldn't believe it when I looked at when this episode was, that it was that long
Right.
ago. But we focus solely on the subject of childhood psychopathy. We are not going to give you another episode to review, but I'm sure a lot of you remember it and it's there if you guys want to go back. But we wanted to sort of recap some of the main points because it dovetails nicely into here when we talk about how some of these are exhibited and formed in childhood. So we have to remember that general misconceptions and cultural influences in society have long misunderstood childhood behavior, labeling children as both innocent and evil. And then there has always been these unrealistic societal expectations that make extreme behaviors in children more shocking or a topic to kind of latch onto. Like think about the super predator fallacy, right? So we want to kind of lay that foundation first. Again, diagnosing personality disorders before age 18 is not standard, but early behaviors can really indicate future concerns. And many behaviors linked to psychopathy are likely to stem from that third leg of trauma, neglect, or the adverse environments.
Drilling down into the prevalence in children, just to the stats, about 1% of children may exhibit callous and unemotional traits in their environment response. And then the DSM 5 now recognize callous and unemotional traits to be a better assessment of risk factors. And over 50 studies now confirm that CU traits in children are highly predictive of future criminality. Again, we now have the benefit of years and years of data to really process and look forward to predict. So if we look at this as the three-factor model of psychopathy development, we have first genetic predisposition, nature, environmental influences, nurture, but then that last piece that ties in with our previous episodes of attachment theory, parental bonding and attachment issues. But please keep in mind, folks, 80% of children with early psychopathic traits do not grow into adult psychopaths. That's the silver lining of good, knowing that early interventions that we have discussed way back in previous episodes can have long lasting and significant impact on improving that child's possibilities of success.
I think that's a really good end cap for, well, one for this episode, but also for all of our episodes. When there is early identification, not even early, I guess, and not necessarily just with disorders in childhood, but when there's identification and then intervention, like good intervention, there is hope for all of this horrible stuff that we talk about, right? Whether it's
Right.
criminal or whether it's just like a toxic person in your life. So I kind of love that with the worst of the worst that you think of, childhood psychopathy, 80%. I mean, that's a stark statistic there that even if they have early psychopathic traits, they're not going to grow into adult psychopaths. So,
Right. And adding on to that last bit, I want people listening to challenge their own assumptions about what they consider to be appropriate parental bonding
mm,
or appropriate family systems or appropriate family dynamics. Family is and should be a broad term for adults or almost adults who are committed to creating a safe and nurturing environment for our youth. And that can look very different from street to street, from neighborhood to neighborhood, from culture to culture. So please don't fall into this rigid sort of binary view of that a healthy family dynamic has to look like a 1950s version of the nuclear American family, because
Yeah,
that's not what we're talking about. Even if a child lives in the system but is given great containment and has great access to mentors and positive role models, that can have an absolutely beneficial effect. So let's just keep
definitely.
challenging ourselves as we consider this very complex set of behaviors and diagnoses.
As far as entertainment goes, I mean, we've done a lot of these, and we don't want to keep you guys much
Oh my God,
longer.
we could just name them off the top of our head without even a description, right?
So yeah, I mean, feel free to watch the gajillion versions of The Bad Seed or the dozens of the Children of the Corn sequels. I don't know.
Yeah, the
But
boy, the good son or the bad son.
I was just
And
going to
now there's
mention
even the
that.
robot version. What is it? What's the one about the killer robot that's protecting
Oh, I
her
don't know.
owner? Megan.
Oh, Megan,
Yeah.
Megan. But I honestly, like, I had forgotten about The Good Son with Macaulay Culkin.
It's terrifying.
It is so chilling because he's the same age as, like, all of his other popular movies in the 90s,
Yeah.
Home Alone, but he's this little violent psychopath that tortures poor little Elijah Wood, who's
Little
so young
like
too.
angelic Elijah
I
Wood. They
just,
both look
like,
like
had to
angels
mention
until,
that
yeah.
one's, like, very chilling. Too much.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah,
thank you folks for being so patient with us today. This has been a long and very dense episode. I'm sure that this will give us the opportunity in a future Behind the Couch to pull in one of our experts on this particular issue with
that'd be cool.
children and having to do with conduct disorder. That will be a
Yes.
fascinating conversation.
For sure. So happy March, everyone. Happy spring break if you have that coming up. And we'll see you next time on LA
Not so.
Confidential. Bye.
Bye, folks.
We sincerely thank you for spending some time with us today. LA Not So Confidential is part of the Crawlspace Media Network. Each episode is hosted, produced, and written by Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh. Our post-production editing and sweetening magic is handled by the multi-talented Jason Usry of Ear Cult Productions.
Our theme music, entitled Cool Vibes Film Noir, is composed and performed by the talented Kevin MacLeod. He graciously allows us to use his music via a Creative Commons Attribution license. Please check out all of Kevin's amazing work on YouTube.
All of the resources for each episode can be found on our website at la-not-so-confidential.com. You can find us on Instagram at LA Not So Podcast, on X at LA Not So Pod, and on Facebook at LA Not So Confidential. Media inquiries and bookings are scheduled at alienistentertainment@gmail.com.
Once a month, we go live on YouTube on Saturday afternoon. So pay attention to our social media announcements to join our interactive broadcast entitled Behind the Couch, where we interview guests on a number of psych, criminal justice, and true crime topics.
And lastly, we'd be honored if you joined our Patreon at patreon.com/LA Not So Podcast. With a subscription, you get an ad-free listening experience, additional content, host interaction, and you'll be the first to know about upcoming live events, social gatherings, and super cool swag.
Thanks for listening, and join us next time on LA
Not So
Confidential.